ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد، وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا رسول الله، صلى الله وسلم عليك يا أبا عبد الله، يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة، يا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز فوزا عظيما. قال تعالى في كتابه الحكيم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قالوا سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. صدق الله العلي العظيم، وصلوا على محمد وآل محمد. A few nights ago we mentioned that the Quran describes the human being as being born out of total ignorance, emerging from total ignorance. And that through the proper utilization of our senses, such as our hearing, our vision, and our fu'ad, which includes both the intellect and our emotions, we begin to properly understand the world around us. But even then, what we know and what we understand compared to the true reality around us is not but a drop in an entire ocean. If you study the natural world today, scientists tell us that when it comes to our universe, everything in the observable universe, the planets, the solar systems, the stars, all of that physical matter represents only about 3% of the known universe. The rest is made up of dark energy and dark matter. And the reason they call them dark is because they're able to measure them by way of process of elimination and subtraction, but we can't really detect dark matter and dark energy. Dark energy is what is responsible for the expansion and the acceleration of our universe. 3% after many years. If you look at our own Earth, much of our oceans, our vast oceans, remain unexplored. New ways of thinking, new technologies, new sciences are developing every single day. And this sheds light on the verse in the Quran that says, وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا, that you have not been given knowledge except for a fraction. And it is through true struggle and exertion that we begin to comprehend little by little. Our teacher, our dear teacher, Ayatollah Sayyid Munir al-Khabbaz, one day taught us, he mentioned the hadith in class. He said, the hadith says, لا يعطيك العلم بعضه حتى تعطيه كلك. You think you spend a few years and all of a sudden you're knowledgeable and you can preach to others. And you can tell people what you know and impress people with your knowledge and your expertise. The hadith says that knowledge will not give you some of it until you give it all of you. If you give knowledge some exertion, you'll get nothing. You have to give everything in order to get back just a small fraction. It's like if you were to go to the vending machine and the drink in the vending machine costs $1. What happens if you put in 97 cents? You don't get 97% of the drink. You get 0% of it. You have to put in the full dollar to get the full amount. This is an analogy for our process of learning. So, on a personal level, we find that some people live their entire lives in complete oblivion, complete ignorance. Some of that is intentional, some is unintentional. For those that intentionally live in ignorance, they say that ignorance is bliss. I'd rather not know, because if I knew, then I would be held accountable. And from an Islamic perspective, there is a minor truth to this. When it comes to our day-to-day behaviors, we are commanded to carry on our lives with certain assumptions. I'll give you an example. If you walked into the home of a Muslim, then you have if they serve you food, you have no obligation to investigate whether this food is halal or not. So you have no obligation there. This is meant to make our lives easier. But in every other aspect, we are required to seek knowledge. We are required to seek understanding and awareness. Imam Ali alayhi salam says in his famous narration that people fall into 3 categories. One is alimun rabbani, a scholar, and not just any scholar, a scholar that shares with others. Some people, they learn something and they keep it for themselves. Alimun rabbani, a person who is in the process of growing others. The second is muta'allimun ala sabilin najat, the learned person on the path, the learning person, the student on the path of salvation. And then everybody else falls into the third category, which is hamajun wa ru'a, savages. People who they move in any direction. They don't stand for anything, so they fall for everything. These are the categories of people. The Prophet, peace be upon him, when he observed his community or members of his community, whether they were Muslim or non-Muslim, when he observed them falling short, he would constantly say, Allahumma aghfir liqawmi fa innahum la ya'lamun. Oh Allah, excuse, pardon, forgive my people, for they do not know. If they knew and if they understood, it would be a completely different story. And there's a reason why Imam Hussein alayhi salam on the day of Ashura stood in front of the people and identified himself, so that there would be no excuse for those who fought against him that we didn't know who we were fighting against. In the beginning, some of them thought they were simply fighting against insurgents or rebels that were standing up against the Khalifa. But Imam Hussein alayhi salam on the day of Ashura stood in front of the people and he identified himself. If you do not know who I am, then this is my father, this is my mother, this is my grandfather, this is my uncle, this is my brother, this is what the Prophet said about us. So that it would be 100% clear with no doubts. So the same goes for us. Getting what we want out of life, one of the biggest challenges is that our ignorance, our blind spots, our ego, and sometimes even our unsupervised core values act as a hindrance, act as a barrier in our way, in our path to getting what we want out of life, to happiness, to fulfillment, to self-actualization, to understanding. The Russian psychologist Abraham Maslow, some of you are familiar with the concept of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He said that every human being has certain needs that they want fulfilled throughout their life. And beginning at the bottom, it starts with the most basic needs of food and shelter. And then it goes up to another level, to health, security. And then another level is love and belonging, meaning that if you're thinking about food and water and security, you don't really have time to think about issues such as love and belonging. These are higher level issues. And then at the top of the pyramid of the hierarchy of needs is self-actualization. And self-actualization basically means that you are striving to reach your potential and to develop your potential. So you don't think about striving to develop your potential if you don't have oxygen. If you don't have oxygen, you're thinking about, how do I get oxygen? You're not thinking about food and water. So what are some of the pitfalls, and what are some of the challenges and obstacles that we have when it comes to self-actualization and reaching our potential? I'd like to share with you a couple of concepts from a few authors, and we'll go from there. So there was a book written a while ago by an author, Ray Dalio. He wrote a book called Principles, Life and Work Principles. And what he said is that for most people, when they try to get what they want out of life, there are two barriers that stand in front of them. The first barrier is the ego. The second barrier are blind spots. Ego and blind spots. And he says that in order to understand how the ego, our ego, and our blind spots hold us back, we have to understand the mechanism, the super mechanism that is the brain, and how does the brain work. So, number one is our ego. And our ego refers to the subliminal defense mechanism that is instilled in each and every one of us. We all have a subliminal defense mechanism. Think about how countries have borders, but then on top of the borders, they also have mechanisms that protect invasion or intrusion into those borders, such as, the radar defense systems, the missile defense systems. So our ego that's within us, it serves a purpose. Some people say you have to get rid of your ego, or you have to subdue your ego, or you have to crush your ego, or delete your ego. Well, in reality, we can't do that because it's a part of our nafs. It's a part of who we are. Your ego serves the purpose of self-preservation, and every human being requires a measure of self-preservation so that we don't do things which are foolish. We don't embarrass ourselves in public. However, sometimes this ego cannot tell the difference between a real threat and what is not a real threat. Imagine, sometimes they say that these advanced radar systems that are in place to detect foreign flying objects. Sometimes they can't tell the difference between an actual flying object and a flock of birds. That's why they have to verify. And there have been instances in history where they've fired a missile or fired a projectile at something that was not a threat because of improper verification. So the ego works the same way. It's a certain defense mechanism that we have. The challenge is that the ego doesn't always detect threats properly. So what does that mean? So part of our ego is, again, going back to the concept of the brain. If you look at the brain as the lower brain and the higher brain, so we're not talking about various parts for the sake of just for this actual specification here. The lower brain is where our emotions emerge from. At the center of that is the amygdala. And the amygdala is that part of the brain where you will find our most raw emotions, versus the upper part of the brain, which is the neocortex. And the neocortex is where you find logic, reasoning, and language, being able to process language. In human beings, the neocortex is larger than any other species. This is why our ability to use reason and rationale and language is more developed than any other species. However, when it comes to that lower part of the brain, which controls fear, which controls the need for security, the need for belonging, it's a very primitive and animalistic part of our brain. So when you study the desires of man, when you see the most primitive desires of man come out, that's because the amygdala is taking over the cortex, the neocortex. So together, when we have both the ego and our blind spots, it makes it very difficult to objectively see what is going on in front of us. Some of those who stood in battle against the Prophet, or Imam Ali alayhi salam, or against Imam Hussein alayhi salam. The Quran describes those who rejected the message of the Prophet as وَجَحَدُوا بِهَا وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا أَنفُسُهُم. Even though they knew from a logical perspective what was being said was correct and was true, however, their impulses that resided within the nafs was driving them. Their ego and their animalistic desire was what was driving them. So we have the higher level neocortex, the lower level amygdala. So these two parts of the brain sometimes conflict with one another. And you can sense that conflict. Sometimes if you've ever indulged in something that you were not supposed to indulge in, and then a few moments later you start to feel bad about it. This is a representation, a manifestation of the conflict between the higher brain and the lower brain. You know, you come back home, you grab some fast food, some Taco Bell, whatever, on the way home. You bring back too much because your eyes are hungrier than your stomach. You sit down in front of the TV, you kick your feet up, you consume all of it, and within 5 minutes, you know, your gut starts hurting you. And then you start to question, why did I just do what I did? This is because your amygdala was looking for something. Your hunger and your fear was driving you in that moment. And you weren't thinking clearly. Now that your body secured the food, you turned to the upper part of your brain and you started to think. The challenge is that many people are unaware of what's driving them in the first place. Is it this lower desire, or is it my higher thinking? And then the problem becomes more complex when you're dealing with another person, because each person has the lower part of the brain and the upper part of the brain. And so you can see how there's like a multiplicative effect. So when you're arguing with someone, for instance, in a heated argument, who are you arguing with? Are you arguing with Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde? And when you're arguing, who is coming out? Is it Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde? If you understand the analogy. So this acts as a challenge when it comes to understanding others around us. And this is why you see sometimes that even the most intelligent of people, the highest IQ people, they get in some of the most petty debates and petty arguments. Because they're not using their higher brain, they're not using their rationale and their neocortex. It's their amygdala, their need for belonging, their need to be right, their need for safety, their need to be secure that is pushing them towards those behaviors. So within ourselves, we need to understand what drives us. And this is very close to the Islamic concept of an-nafsul lawwama and an-nafsul ammara. In a way, we can relate the lower self that drives our needs to an-nafsul ammara, an-nafsul ammarati bis-su', and we can relate the higher self, the logical self, to an-nafsul lawwama or an-nafsul mutma'inna. So this is number one. We've got our ego that we've got to deal with. The second is our blind spots. What our blind spots refers to is the areas of our rational thinking which is flawed. Because just because you're able to exercise rational thinking over emotional thinking, it doesn't necessarily mean that your rational thinking is correct. your rational thinking is still subject to blind spots. That's why they teach us in driving school that when you're driving a vehicle, you use your blinker, you look in the rear view mirror, you look in the side mirrors, but the final step of turning and merging from one lane to another is what? You have to turn your head over. And when you're turning your head over, what are you looking at? You're looking at your blind spots. In today's vehicles, they have advanced technology which either a light turns on or it begins to beep to make it easier for you to detect your blind spots. But the blind spots will always be there. So even if we get to our rational way of thinking, we still have to combat our blind spots. So we need to begin with this understanding that we all have these two barriers that exist within us, our ego and our blind spots. A hadith attributed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. He would say, Allahumma arini al-ashya'a kama hiya. Oh Allah, show me things, reveal to me things, matters, issues as they are. Meaning, do not allow my judgment to be clouded by anything. Show me the thing in its reality. This is a beautiful dua. So being able to see things accurately. So when it comes to understanding ourselves and making a proper assessment of ourselves, where do we begin? In the 1950s, there was a technique developed by two psychologists. This technique is called the Johari window. And that name, Johari, is an amalgamation, it's a combination of the two names of the psychologists. And basically, if you can think of a window pane with 4 quadrants, it's an exercise meant to practice self-awareness and to show us our own blind spots. It's a group exercise that's conducted in some places. And if you can imagine 4 quadrants. On one side, you have the x-axis and the y-axis. There are things which are known to others and not known to others. And then on the other axis, there are things which are known to yourself and not known to yourself. So you have 4 quadrants. In one quadrant are the things which are known to yourself and known to others. Right? These are the things which are obvious. And they call this quadrant the arena quadrant. If something is out in the arena, you're able to see it and others are able to see it. So they're all parts of our personality, parts of who we are that we know is true about ourselves and other people also know is true about us. Like our basic physical characteristics. Your name, what school you went to, if it's known amongst the people. Some of your hobbies, right? And then there's the quadrant which is known to yourself, but it is not known to other people. This is called the facade. Because when we're out and about, there are things that we know about ourselves that other people do not know about us. And so in order to cover those things, we put up a facade. And we all have areas that we know about ourselves that nobody else knows about us. Of course, except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can put up a facade for all of society except against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then there are things which are not known to the self and not known to others. This remains unknown. And this is to be uncovered. But the most important part is the area, the most productive and the most revealing part is the area which is known to others, but it is not known to ourselves. This quadrant is dangerous. And this is what is referred to as the blind spot. When people know something about us and it's apparent, but we don't know about it ourselves. If I have food stuck in my teeth and I don't know about it, others know about it. This is a personal blind spot. or if my buttons are not matching, mismatching. This is something that people know about me, but I don't know about myself. The challenge is when it comes to personality traits that people recognize within us and we do not recognize within ourselves. And furthermore, we are not willing to explore it and we're not willing to take advice. This becomes very dangerous. So brothers and sisters, we need to learn to become open and audit ourselves and surround ourselves with people that can tell us the truth. The hadith says, صديقك من صدقك لا من صدقك. صديقك من صدقك لا من صدقك. That your sadiq, your friend, is the one that tells you the truth, not the one that believes everything you say. صديقك من صدقك لا من صدقك. Most of us, we would rather surround ourselves with yes people. Yes boss, no boss, yes dad, no dad, yes husband, no. We would rather surround ourselves with people that will just nod their heads because it's uncomfortable and it's embarrassing if someone points out that your buttons are mismatched, or you have bad breath, or you're a terrible leader. It's uncomfortable for us to face these truths. Why? Remember, the ego kicks in. The self-defense mechanism. Because the ego cannot tell the difference between constructive, rational criticism and a personal attack. The initial response on the radar that's in our minds is that this is a personal attack. You need to respond as soon as possible. This is how it is for most of us. The Quran reminds us, خُذِ الْعَفْوَ وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ وَإِمَّا يَنزَغَنَّكَ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ نَزْغٌ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ إِنَّهُ سَمِيعٌ عَلِيمٌ. When the shaitan comes to you and he pricks you, he pokes you like that, فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ, take a few moments. In a narration, a man comes to Al-Imam Al-Hasan Al-Mujtaba alayhi salam, and I've seen this narration attributed to both Al-Imam Al-Hasan or Al-Imam Al-Husayn alayhi salam. Both of them are of the same purified light. But it says that a man comes to Medina, to Al-Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam, and he's looking for the Imam. He comes from Ash-Sham, Syria, where, the hornet's nest, where Muawiyah and Yazid had worked for people for many years, Muawiyah specifically. He finds the Imam. And what does he do when he finds the Imam? He begins to curse at him. He begins to swear at him that you are like this, and your father was like this, and your mother was like this. And all of them were lies and propaganda that Muawiyah had taught the people. Such as the lie that he had taught people that Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam does not even pray. This was the type of propaganda that was instilled in the mind of people. So the Imam is patient with him. He takes it all in. Then he says to him, he says, you look like a traveler. Is that correct? The man says, yes, I have come from Asham specifically to see you and curse. The Imam says to him, he says, do you have a place to stay? Before we talk about this, before we discuss this, do you have a place to stay? If you don't have a place to stay, come to my home. There's place in my home. Do you have food to eat? If you don't have food to eat, come to my home. At that moment, the man has a change of heart. And he says that I wished at that moment that the earth would open up and swallow me whole because of how embarrassed I was. He said, I went from the Imam being the most viled person, the most despised person, to the most beloved person in my eyes because of this treatment. Because he didn't react right away. وَإِمَّا يَنزَغَنَّكَ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ نَزْغٌ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ إِنَّهُ سَمِيعٌ عَلِيمٌ. Some psychologists have also delved one step further into why people consistently behave the way that they do. Sometimes we make mistakes and we correct it. But sometimes we consistently make mistakes one after another, and we find ourselves in one situation after another. When it comes to, for instance, failed relationships. People go from one failed relationship to another failed relationship. And some psychologists have said that this is because of people's core values. And tonight's lecture topic is core values, so I want to spend a few minutes talking about core values. And the definition of core values is this: it is our most basic thoughts about ourselves and other people. So if you examine and you audit what thoughts you have about yourself and about other people. For instance, if you grew up, and by the way, core values, we'll go on to explain, that a lot of the times your core values and the way they drive you is not from a conscious manner, it's from a subconscious manner. Meaning that it drives you without you even knowing that it drives you most of the time, unless you explore it. So, beliefs, core values, or core beliefs, not core values, that we may have about ourselves and others. For instance, if you grew up with the idea that everybody is guilty until proven innocent, this is different from the core belief that everybody is innocent until proven guilty. These are at the opposite ends of the spectrum. And we see today with the way people behave is that I'm not going to trust this person. They have to prove first. I think in certain parts of the world, people are notorious for this type of approach. So, this is a core belief. Another core belief that one may hold about themselves or others is entitlement. If a person grew up in a household where their parents gave them everything without them having to work hard, without them even having to ask for it. Some parents are like this. They want to give their parents everything they want to give their kids everything without them even asking for it. Instead of being a leader, they become a groupie or a doormat. Excuse my language. But this is the reality of it. The child grows up with a core belief of a sense of entitlement. What happens to a person who has a sense of entitlement and walks into a relationship and they don't get what they want? Or they walk into the workplace or a school and they don't get what they want? It's a tough reality that they have to face. This is a core belief. Another core belief, which is more of a personality disorder, nastajiru billah, is narcissism. When a person believes that the entire world revolves around them and that people are there to please them and serve them. This is one of the biggest disorders, behavioral disorders and challenges. Because there's almost nothing that you can say to a narcissist that is correct. I was speaking to a therapist one time, and a Muslim therapist. I said, what happens, you come across many different types of personalities and behaviors and mental illnesses and all of that. I said, what happens when you come across a narcissist? She said, narcissists don't walk into my office. And if they do, they'll walk out of the office and they'll say, can you believe that dumb doctor, that therapist, what they're telling me about myself? Nastajiru billah. And there's no cure for it, based on what I've understood. There's no cure for narcissism. You can curb them. They can develop a sense of self-awareness. But for the most part, a narcissist remains a narcissist. This is a part of core beliefs. So, our core beliefs, we are not always the author of our core beliefs. Sometimes it's the way that society has treated us. But just because it's not our fault that we grew up believing a certain way does not mean it's not our responsibility. There's a difference, brothers and sisters, between fault and responsibility. If somebody knocked at your door and you opened up your door and you found a baby in a crib, the baby in the crib is not your fault that the baby is there, but it's now your responsibility to take care of it. So whatever you grew up with, and we have a tendency of blaming our parents, our grandparents, they did this for me, they didn't do this for me, they did this too much, they did this too little. And even if it was their fault, and even if they were abusive, they had no right to become abusive, but it is now your responsibility to own your life from now forward, now that you realize what's happened. And this is a very tough pill for people to swallow. But this is the height of responsibility. Was it Imam Hussein alayhi salam's fault that what happened at Karbala happened? It wasn't his fault. Not in the least. Not in the least. He avoided it with every decision that he made, with every step that he took. But that doesn't mean that he failed to be responsible. He could have said, okay, it's not my fault and it's not my responsibility, and went the other direction. We need to take responsibility for our lives. So a lot of what drives us is subconscious, not conscious. If you can, to describe subconscious and conscious, if you can imagine an iceberg, right? And maybe you've seen the picture of how 20% resides on top of the surface and 80% resides on the bottom. Our conscious thoughts, meaning the thoughts that we are aware of in the moment, are that 20% that resides on the top. The rest of the bottom is the 80%, which experts either refer to as subconscious or superconscious or unconscious. It all refers to the same thing. Sigmund Freud spoke about our conscious thought, and this model is referred to as the mental iceberg. So at the top of this iceberg is the conscious level, which includes our thoughts and perceptions. If I was to walk up to you and show you something and say, what are your thoughts on this? You can immediately talk about your thoughts or your perceptions. If you go one level below the surface, you're at the pre-conscious level. This includes our memories and our stored knowledge. You might have learned something in the 6th grade or the 7th grade and you completely forgot about it. The other day, my 4-year-old daughter said the word parallelogram, and it reminded me of, 5th grade or 4th grade. We learn things that we will never use in our education system. So this is something that is pre-conscious. It's not at the top of my mind what a parallelogram is, but I have some sort of idea because of what I learned in school. And then there's the subconscious. This is what drives most of our behaviors. Fears, irrational wishes, immoral urges, shameful experiences, selfish needs. These all live deep within and are the driving force behind many of our decisions, which we do not see. Because like the iceberg, you're only seeing the tip of it, 20% on top, and you don't realize the 80% that lives below the surface. Speaking of icebergs, when the Titanic crashed in April of 1912, there were a number of survivors. Among those survivors were the 2 sailors that were in the crow's nest that were supposed to be looking out for icebergs. And apparently when the Titanic first left from, if I'm not mistaken, Ireland, it first headed to Southampton. There were a pair of binoculars up there, but when it departed from Southampton across the Atlantic Ocean to come to the eastern seaboard of the United States, the binoculars were nowhere to be found. So they questioned them. The 2 sailors, they survived. 4 days later, there was a Senate hearing in New York where they questioned them. They said, well, what about the binoculars? Weren't you seeing? They said there were no binoculars there, and we didn't ask for them. So the Senate committee asked them, they said, well, what if you did have the binoculars? Would you have seen it? They said, yes, we would have seen it enough to divert the Titanic. Most of us, we are missing our binoculars in life, and we don't want to go looking for our binoculars. In medical terms, there's a condition referred to as cortical blindness. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir, and it's a temporary type of blindness where the eyes work, the eye itself works, but there's no vision. And the reason there's no vision is because the visual cortex, which is located at the back of the brain, is damaged. However, there are other structures in the brain that are still working. So a person experiencing cortical blindness, even though they can't see, they can maneuver around certain objects. There's another structure in the brain referred to as the Superior Colliculus. And this sends information to the parts of the brain that guide our movement. So when we're walking around with our subconscious thoughts guiding us in the wrong direction, it's like us experiencing cortical blindness. You can maneuver to a certain extent, but you can't fully see what's going on in front of you. So, what are our core beliefs, and how do we understand our core beliefs? Number one is that if you find yourself in a cycle where you have the same repetitive behaviors and in the same situation year after year, month after month, decade after decade, that means that you have to do some exploration of your core beliefs. What are some of your motives? You have to look beneath the surface. Sometimes we need to speak to a therapist. Sometimes we need to speak to a trusted friend or a mentor. And we need to practice radical open-mindedness and be completely open. The more you are open, the more you are transparent, the more you are open-minded, the more success and clarity you will begin to gain in your life, brothers and sisters. Something that most people walk around without. A prime example of that was the enemies of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. They had experienced a type of blindness because their egos took over. Their blind spots were not clear for them. Their subconscious motives and their drivers had taken over. Those who had clarity found themselves in the camp of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And tonight, within these final few minutes, we honor the companions of Sayyid al-Shuhada Abi Abdullah al-Hussein. Those people who found themselves in a difficult situation, but they were not confused. They had clarity. And because they had clarity, it excited them to be on the side of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. They were exuberant, not necessarily happy, but joyous and exuberant, because they knew that they were on the side of the truth. They knew that they were on the side, on the path of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Among those companions was the noble companion Jawn Mawla Abi Dhar al-Ghifari, a man who lived with Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, the righteous companion. And when he passed away, he found himself in the home of the Ahlul Bayt, in the home of Al-Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, then in the home of Al-Imam al-Hasan al-Mujtaba, then in the home of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And of course, he was a free man. You know, we tend to think that he was a slave. No, he was a free man. But he decided to stick around with the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. And so on that day, on the day of Ashura, Imam Hussein alayhi salam turned and he said, ألا هل من ناصر ينصرنا ألا هل من معين يعيننا ألا هل من ذاب يذب عن حرم رسول الله. Is there anyone to come to our rescue? Is there anybody who will come to our aid? Is there anyone who will protect the women folk of the family of the Prophet? And the companions began to stand one by one. Among them, Jawn Mawla Abi Dhar. By this time he was an elderly man. He was an elderly gentleman. Imam Hussein alayhi salam turned to him. He said, "O Jawn," he said, "you have spent your entire life with us, serving us, being with us." He said to him, "Anta talabtana fi afiya." You came to us in goodwill. And now you are free. You no longer have any responsibilities. You can go your way. Live the rest of your life as you want. Jawn turned to him. He said, "Sayyidi Aba Abdullah, أنا في الرخاء ألحس قصاعكم وفي الشدة أخذلكم." He said, during times of prosperity, I was honored to eat from your leftovers. And now that we're experiencing a time of hardship, you think I am going to abandon you? La wallah. No, by God, this will not happen. I will stand by you until my blood mixes with your blood, even though I'm not from the purest lineage, even though I do not smell the best. However, it is my wish that my blood mixes with your pure blood. And he went out into the battlefield, fighting like a brave warrior, until finally he was struck down. When he was struck down, Imam Hussein alayhi salam rushed to him, and he did something that he did not do with anybody else except his son Ali al-Akbar. He placed his cheek on the cheek of Jawn. This was a sign of endearment as he said goodbye to him. Another companion was a young man by the name of Amr ibn Junad al-Ansari. His father, Junad al-Ansari, had gone out into the battlefield. He had fought for Imam Hussein. He had lost his life. All of a sudden, this young boy who was maybe around 11 or 12 years old wanted to go out into the battlefield. He came asking permission from Imam Hussein. Imam Hussein turned him. Imam Hussein said, "I cannot allow a woman, the mother, to be bereaved of two people in one day. I will not allow her to lose her husband and her son in one day." So the young man went back. He went back to his mother, informing her that Imam had not given him permission. All of a sudden, the mother comes back with the child. The mother comes back with the young man to the Imam. She says, Sayyidi Aba Abdullah, I'm asking you permission for him to go out into the battlefield. He tells her that I cannot have you lose your husband and son in one day, in one sitting. She said to him, is it fair? أتثكل أمك الزهراء بولدها ولا أثكل بولدي? Is it fair that your mother Az-Zahra bereaves her son, but is it fair that she bereaves her son and I cannot bereave my son? At that moment, Imam Hussein alayhi salam gave the blessing to the young man, and he went out into the battlefield. Some narrators say that he was reciting poetry. He began to recite poetry in praise of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Amiri Husaynun wa ni'mal amir, sururu fuad al-bashir al-nadhir, Ali wa Fatimatun walidah, fahal ta'lamuna lahu min nadhir. That my Amir is Hussein, my master is Hussein, and the best of masters. Do you know anyone else who is the son of Fatima and Ali? Finally, he went out into the battlefield and was struck down. In those moments, he was brought back and laid to rest among the rest of the companions. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un, wa saya'lamu alladhina zalamu ayya munqalabin yanqalibun, wal 'aqibatu lil muttaqin. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات تابع بيننا وبينهم بالخيرات إنك مجيب الدعوات إنك قاضي الحاجات إنك على كل شيء قدير برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.